Hello everybody, and welcome to a quick little guide on Tarisland's Flame Mage. Now this class has insanely high DPS, one of the highest in the game, slightly better than its own Frost spec, but it's a little tricky to use, especially at first, because it's kind of based heavily around setup, and if you mess up that setup, you'll miss out on a lot of DPS, but hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of its skills and how to use them properly. Now before we begin, I want to point out that there's another version of this skill called Skyfire that you can unlock in your talent tree, but for this guide, I'm going to stick with Fireball because I found that it's both a little bit more cohesive with the rest of your skills and a bit more versatile in multiple scenarios. So the main resource for the Flame Mage in Tarisland is something called Heat. You can gain Heat by using certain skills at very specific times, and Heat doesn't really dissipate until it's used or you leave battle. We'll talk a bit more about how to gain and use Heat in just a moment when we go over the skills. Okay, so the first skill is Fireball. Now Fireball is your basic single target attack, and it gives 1 heat every time you hit an enemy. So if I go ahead and use it now, you see I do a nice little bit of damage, and you might notice that I'm not actually gaining heat at the moment. This is normal. You can only gain heat at certain times in your fights. We'll talk about when those times are in the future, but remember, Fireball just gives you 1 heat every time you attack an enemy. The next skill is Searing Sting. Now Searing Sting is single target as well, but it does a little bit more damage than Fireball, and it gives 3 heat every time you hit a target. As you can see, it's doing significantly more damage than Fireball, where I was doing about 500 non-crit, I'm doing about 800 here with Searing Sting, and it gives 3 heat per hit. Again, you won't see the heat yet, but we'll get to that in a second. Now if you're looking down at your action bar and you're noticing that you only have 1 charge of Searing Sting when I have 3, don't worry about that right now. We're gonna unlock more charges of Searing Sting later on when we get to the talents of this class. The next skill is Heat Bomb. Now this is kind of what your entire class revolves around. The first thing that Heat Bomb does is that it gives a nice little damage over time to the enemy. I say little, but it's actually pretty significant. The next and biggest thing that Heat Bomb does is that it activates your heat bar or your heat meter up here. So you'll see when I use it, this is going to get activated, and only while it's active can we gather heat using skills 1, skill 2, and all the other skills in our arsenal that we'll talk about in a second. So remember, when you use Heat Bomb, it'll activate that heat bar and will have some period of time to gather heat. Once that time runs out, Heat Bomb will explode, and the more heat stacks that you've gathered, the greater the damage that that explosion will do. So I'll show it to you here. So I'll go ahead and use Heat Bomb on this enemy, and for a moment I'll have the ability to gather heat stacks. Remember, Searing Sting gives 3 heat per hit, and then when the time runs out, it'll explode and do a very large chunk of damage. We'll talk a little bit more about how to maximize the number of stacks of heat you can gather in that period of time when we talk about skill rotations near the end of the video. The next skill is Blazing Orb. Now Blazing Orb is kind of similar to Heat Bomb in that it is a delayed explosion. So you activate it, it'll hang around the enemy, and then it'll explode. But unlike Heat Bomb, this isn't based on any heat charges or anything of that sort. Instead, Blazing Orb will always crit, and the amount of damage it does is actually dependent on your crit rate. So for this class, building crit rate is actually incredibly useful and incredibly important. And having a high crit rate makes a very significant difference. Now again, you'll notice that I have 2 charges of Blazing Orb and you might only have 1. That's also unlocked in talents, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The final thing that Blazing Orb does is that when that delayed explosion happens, when it explodes, it's actually a pretty nice AoE damage, and it gives 3 stacks of heat per enemy hit. So it's really good to use this right before you use Heat Bomb. So I can show you that right now. So I'll use Blazing Orb on this dummy here. You'll see these orbs orbiting, and then it'll explode and do some damage. Now remember, each hit of Blazing Orb onto an enemy gives 3 stacks of heat when the heat bar is active. So you can use Blazing Orb, follow it up immediately by Heat Bomb, and when that delayed explosion happens, you'll gain the stacks. Now, I said 3, but you see I've gotten 5 here. You can increase the number of stacks you get using talents, and we'll cover all the talents in just a minute. The next skill is called Fire Tornado. Now this is an AoE skill as well, but it is a channeled skill. You can move during it, but you can't jump. So you'll see here when I'm using it, I'm channeling and I can move, but if I had jumped, I would have cancelled my attack. When you use Fire Tornado, the more enemies you hit, the lower the cooldown of Fire Tornado gets. So if it hits 1 enemy, the cooldown gets reduced by 1 second, and if you hit 2, it'll get reduced by 2. And in fact, if you hit enough enemies, you'll just be able to use it again instantly. Now this skill does give heat. In fact, it gives 1 heat for every enemy hit. So if you hit 3 enemies, it'll give 3 heat, and if you hit 4, it'll give 4. But the damage is low and the channeling time is kind of high, so this skill isn't super useful outside of fighting multiple mobs at a time. Typically, if you're on a boss, you just want to be avoiding this skill entirely and spamming fireball instead. But if there are 3 or more mobs, even in a boss fight where the boss has minions, this comes in super handy in building those stacks of heat. The next skill is Flame Boost. Now, before I speak about Flame Boost, I want you to notice that the skill description for this skill is completely wrong. It's basically using the skill description from Fire Tornado, and it's completely wrong. This is your basic self buff, and it'll buff crit damage and crit rate. Now, there is an interesting feature of this skill, which is that it's not affected by global cooldowns. So for those of you who are not aware, when you use a skill, you can see all of the other skills go into this little mini cooldown. Now that's called a global cooldown, but you'll notice that Flame Boost uniquely does not. So the best time to use Flame Boost is between skills when they're all on that global cooldown. The final available skill is the Inscribed Stone skill. Now this doesn't do too much for this class. What it basically does is that when you use Heat Bomb, you'll gain heat a little faster, and when you use Searing Sting while Heat Bomb is active, it'll explode it prematurely and also reset the cooldown so you can immediately pop it again. Again, not the most useful Inscribed Stone skill, but it still does come in handy. Okay, so let's talk about talents. Perhaps more than any other class, the Flame Mage is very dependent on its talents, and a lot of these talents change a lot about the class. Now, this isn't an ideal build by any means, but these are the talents that I like to run on this class. The first is Searing Sting Plus. Now, you use Searing Sting a lot with this class, especially with 3 charges of it, so the increase in base damage and the increase in crit rate is a very significant increase in DPS. I would say this is the first of a few must-have talents, so make sure to pick it up. Then we have Rapid Explosion, which basically just reduces the cooldown of Heat Bomb so you can use it more often, and makes it so that when Heat Bomb is active and that heat meter is on, you can gain extra heat by doing crits. The next one is Flame Master. Now all this does is increase your crit rate by 3%, and I wouldn't particularly recommend using this. Just to jump ahead a little bit here, you have this passive which increases the crit damage you do after Heat Bomb based on your current crit rate. So if you're able to hit one of these thresholds by using Flame Master, then I recommend picking it up. The next talent is another must-have. This is Charge Spur, and this is the talent that converts Searing Sting from 1 charge to 3 charges. Remember, Searing Sting gives 3 heat per hit, so the ability to use it 3 times in a row after popping your Heat Bomb is incredibly significant for your DPS. So this talent is a must pick. Next, we've got Burnout, which converts Fireball into a small buff. Basically, whenever you use Fireball, for 8 seconds, you'll do 6% more damage. This is quite useful, but you have to remember to constantly keep this buff up, especially when Heat Bomb and Blazing Orb are about to detonate. Next, we've got another must-have, which is Blazing Orb Plus. Again, we've got 2 charges of Blazing Orb, which we'll get to in a second, and this makes it so that they do 30% more damage on explosion and have a significantly reduced cooldown, which means that you can use it more and more and more. Remember, Blazing Orb additionally gives 5 heat per enemy hit when it explodes as well, so the ability to do more damage and use it more often is huge. So make sure you pick this up. Next, we've got After Heat, which basically allows you to retain some of your heat when Heat Bomb explodes, but it's not all that significant. Then we've got Heat Bomb Plus. So what this does is it'll make the damage over time on Heat Bomb a bit bigger, which is noticeable, so it's nice to have. But more than that, it has a 50% chance of converting Fire Tornado to Instant Fire Tornado when you use Heat Bomb. Now, for the most part, Fire Tornado and Instant Fire Tornado are the same skill, just that Instant Fire Tornado doesn't have that channeling time, but Instant Fire Tornado also pauses that bomb timer for 1 second. And I'll show you that now. So normally, when I use Heat Bomb, you see this timer that allows me to build heat before it runs out and it detonates. But when Instant Fire Tornado is available and I use it, you can see it freezes that timer for about a second. I'll do it again just in case you missed it. And we use it again, and right there, you can see it freezes for about a second. Now, this isn't a very long time, but it does allow you to get a few more stacks of heat built up before it's able to detonate. And Instant Fire Tornado, just like Fire Tornado, does still give 1 heat per enemy hit. Next, we've got Recharge Jewel. This is another absolutely must-have because it gives you 2 charges of Blazing Orb rather than the base 1. And at its max level has a 100% chance to increase heat by 2 extra. So remember, Blazing Orb in its base form has just 1 charge and gives you 3 heat per enemy hit. With this talent, it'll have 2 charges and it'll still give 3 heat per enemy hit, but it'll also give an extra 2 heat on top of that. Now remember, the extra 2 you get isn't based on the number of enemies hit, it's just 2 extra, which is still quite nice to have, especially in boss fights where it's just a single target anyway. It'll go from 3 to 5. Next, we've got Precise Blast. Now this is a bit of a convoluted and confusing talent. Basically, when this talent is activated, your heat bomb goes between 2 modes: odd and even. So the first heat bomb you use in a battle is odd, the second one is even, the third one is odd, the fourth one is even, and so on. When your heat bomb is odd, if the number of heat stacks you have is odd when it detonates, it'll do 15% extra damage. If it's even and the number of heat charges you have is even, it'll do extra damage. This might not be super intuitive at first, but let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I haven't started a battle yet. So the first heat bomb I'm about to use on this dummy here is going to be odd numbered. And when I use it, you'll see that it comes up orange there. And if it's an odd number of heat charges, it'll do extra damage. The next heat bomb I'm gonna use is going to be even. And you can see I don't have that extra damage now. But if I have 4 charges, I've now got extra damage. If it's still not really very clear to you, go ahead and jump into one of these testing areas and try it out for yourself. After a few times, it'll become pretty clear what's going on with that skill. Then we've got Flame Rush, which basically reduces the cooldown of Flame Boost by 20 seconds and adds a little bit more haste. Now the haste isn't very significant, but the reduced cooldown of Flame Boost does mean that you'll be using it a lot more often because the base cooldown is 60 seconds. So reducing by 20 seconds is a 33% reduction. So you'll be using Flame Boost a lot more often and your DPS will scale accordingly. So this is a pretty useful talent. Then right below that, we've got Flame Boost Plus, which just makes Flame Boost last longer and increase crit damage even more. Now this, combined with the cooldown reduction, is actually pretty significant. Finally, we've got Unstable Explosive, which just adds a buff to the end of heat bomb. So when it explodes, there's a chance that your attack will be increased by a certain amount. This isn't super significant, but it's a nice little boost with literally no extra work. So I do recommend picking it up with any leftover talent points that you have. Okay, now that we've got our talents out of the way and we've boosted up our skills a little bit, how do we use those skills to do as much DPS as possible? The basic rotation is to start with Fireball, so you gain that initial damage boost from the talent that we had for 8 seconds. Then we'd use Blazing Orb to set up an initial small explosion, followed by Flame Boost while the rest of the skills are on that global cooldown. Then we'll instantly activate Heat Bomb before the first Blazing Orb explodes, so that when it does, we'll get those heat stacks, and then we'll use Blazing Orb again for a little bit more damage and for another 5 stacks of heat. After that, we'll just use Searing Sting 3 times to build as many stacks as possible before Heat Bomb detonates. So here it is all together. And just like that, you've got a nice little rotation. Now, some of these skills won't always be available for you to use at all times. The biggest ones are, of course, Flame Boost, and sometimes you'll only have 1 charge of Blazing Orb available. In those cases, just skip the skills that just aren't available. For example, sometimes in a big fight, you might just have to do Fireball, Blazing Orb, Heat Bomb, and Searing Sting. So you'll be missing Flame Boost and that second Blazing Orb, which is completely fine. However, it is kind of important that you use at least 1 Blazing Orb before Heat Bomb, so you have those extra heat stacks and some extra damage. And you should have at least 2 charges of Searing Sting to use after you've popped Heat Bomb. One other interesting fact is that if you use Heat Bomb and start building heat stacks, but the enemy that you've targeted with Heat Bomb dies, then you don't lose the stacks of heat. They just become inactive like this. So a great way to prepare for upcoming bosses in a dungeon is by using Heat Bomb and then stacking heat but killing mobs on the way to that boss, so that when you reach that boss, you'll have a max stack of 40 heat ready to use on the boss itself. The other thing I want to mention is that this class is actually kind of dependent on ping. If you have 200, 300 ping like I do, expect to miss out on a few stacks of heat when you pop heat bump. But don't worry, the class is still perfectly viable, especially if you're well geared. It's just that you're not going to be reaching that optimal efficiency and that maximum DPS. And that's it for Tarisland's Flame Mage. Again, this class can be confusing, convoluted, and tricky at first, but once you start using it, you'll find that you can get into this rhythm with all of your skills, and it's very easy to flow from one to another, especially if your ping isn't super high. So I hope this video has either interested you in playing Flame Mage, which I highly recommend if you're into DPS, because the ceiling for this class is so high, I don't think anybody's even seen it yet. Or hopefully I've at least helped you get better at this class so that you can do your dungeons and do your raids more efficiently and faster. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.